Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Athol Quayson and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. This is the first of a two-part episode on the socio-political history of Cape Town's once infamous Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was jailed by the Apartheid regime for 18 of the 27 years in which he was incarcerated. But today, I want to celebrate Athol Fugard by paying attention to his play, The Island, whose first production was held on Robben Island and had Nelson Mandela himself in the role of Creon in a now famous adaptation of Sophocles Antigone. Even though the play is not about disability, as we shall see in next week's episode, Robben Island encompasses a long history of leper colony before it became a prison to hold political prisoners. Indeed, the General Infirmary of Robben Island operated as one of the instruments of colonial public health policy from 1846 to 1931, when the last of its three medical institutions, the Hospital for People with Leprosy, was closed down. The chronic sick hospital had been shut down in 1891, with the lunatic asylum following suit in 1931. This episode will reroute Robben Island's history through the prism of disability to show how the confinement of people with diverse disabilities prefigures the very logic of political apartheid itself. Thus, the racial economy of apartheid, which forms the backdrop to the play, also has behind it the longer history of disability and of differentiated embodiment that was at the core of Robben Island. Readers of Athol Fugard's The Island will recall the point towards the end of scene 1 when John mimes a telephone conversation with one of his old friends on the mainland. Both he and Winston have returned to their cell after a hard day's work on the lime quarry, undertaking the pointless task of filling in and emptying out a wheelbarrow onto each other's mound of sand. Though we cannot tell what exactly is being said on the other side of the line, we are able to piece together bits and pieces from John's end of the conversation. He asks about his friends, tells his interlocutor about their own hard life at the Robben Island prison and the daily difficulties they are having with Hodoshi, the blatantly sadistic prison warden who tries to make a living hell of their lives. John finally asks for a message to be passed on to Princess, his wife. Winston sneaks in a request for a message to be passed on to his own wife too. But by that point in the telephone conversation, the two friends are less than enthusiastic about carrying on the make-believe. The stage directions say that the mention of his wife guillotines Winston's excitement and fun. After a few seconds of silence, he crawls back heavily to his bed and lies down. A similar shift in mood takes place in John. Even though the word guillotine signals decapitation, the fact that it is coupled with a description of John's crawling back heavily suggests that it also has vague resonances of emotional dismemberment and disablement. It is interesting to note, however, that the force of the word guillotine comes from reading the stage directions, whereas in performance, the actor's rendering of the effect of the conversation upon him would have been returned to the level of his body and his gestures. Thus, Even though in reading the state directions the word might be taken as operating at the level of metaphor, we have to visualize the sudden deflation of the two characters' egos and their return of their bodies to the harsh realities of incarceration. The mental and physical are overlaid upon each other, and the moral issue of the loss of freedom and how one must act with regard to that loss is translated through the bodies of the characters on the stage. There are several things that have been suggested by this point in the play, and that are more or less encapsulated in the telephone conversation itself and the two men's gestural reactions to it. First is the blatantly obvious point about their nostalgia for freedom. But their nostalgia is not just for freedom, but for freedom as it is connected to their past as freedom fighters. In other words, the nostalgia is for a particular form of freedom, which is ultimately defined by their being political beings first and foremost. Second is that the telephone conversation is only one point in the various modalities of the taking on of roles that is also at the heart of the play. For they are rehearsing their parts in a special production of Sophocles Antigone, in which Winston will be Antigone and John Creon. Getting Winston to believe in the efficacy of the suspension of disbelief is one part of John's troubles in trying to persuade his cellmate to rehearse his lines. What is more pressing is the fact that Winston is going to have to dress in drag and perform the role of a woman, something that elicits a strongly negative reaction from him. By the time of the telephone conversation, the two men have gone through a series of adopted roles, most of which have no bearing on the Antigone play they are rehearsing for. The phone conversation is by the final and most dramatic of these adopted roles in the first part of the play. Overarching the thematic of nostalgia for freedom and the rehearsal of various roles is something of much greater significance for the overall dynamic of oppression and resistance that is revealed in the play. This is the thematic of what, following Giorgio Agamben, we might refer to as bare life, that is to say, the life of he who can be killed but not sacrificed. As Agamben points out in Homo Sacer, the biological life of those situated on the periphery of the political order is precisely that which defines that order in the first place. It is the instantiation of the exception that allows the invocation of sovereignty. The excluded example helps to define that which is included. Thus, the exception is the limit case that folds into itself both the logic of the dominant order and its definition of what is exclusionary to that logic. For Agamben, the bare biological life of the subject is the precise instantiation of the logic of the political system, since that biological life is meaningless outside the discourse of the polity itself. What should be of interest to us here, however, is not solely Agamben's discussion of the bare life of the Homo Sacer, since, as he acknowledges it, the research agenda he pursues has already been laid out by Hannah Arendt and Michel Foucault. But the example he gives us of the concentration camp as one of the foci for understanding the rule of the exception. He defines the concentration camp not as a historical fact and an anomaly belonging to the past, even if still verifiable, but in some way as the hidden matrix and nomos of the political space in which we are still living. Agamben speculates on the genesis of such concentration camps, suggesting they might be traced to the 1896 Spanish effort in Cuba to suppress local insurrection, or to the camps into which the English herded the Boers at the end of the 19th century in South Africa. Both these instances of states of emergency linked to colonial wars that then engulfed this entire civilian population. However, as will be shown next week, Robben Island was at various points in its history an articulation of a state of emergency and was routinely used as a place to which socially and politically anomalous types were kept separate from normal society and used to define the exception. Returning to Fugard's play, we see that the bare life of John and Winston is defined across a range of practices of the self that they perfect in their incarceration, some of which we have seen in the adoption and rehearsal of roles to play. Their nakedness as prisoners is rehearsed before the imaginary audience of their wives, comrades, and other political interlocutors on the mainland. It is this that gives the telephone conversations such poignancy and significance, for their naked identities are worked out both between themselves and in the anticipation of the reactions of various imagined and real others on the mainland. This seems like an obvious point, yet since the entire gamut of other depicted characters outside of John and Winston is strictly evoked via the reminiscences and projections of the two characters on stage, the idiom of the drama becomes one of the refraction of anticipations. It is these anticipations that worry Winston. He can tell exactly how the other prisoners will respond to him as the female Antigone. It is then for John to persuade him that beyond the laughter that he will provoke, there will also be a space for listening, and that it is this that he must wait for in enacting the role of that redoubtable woman rebel. Commentators have noted that Fugard draws on a tradition that can be traced back to Samuel Beckett. Certainly, the intensity of the relationship between the two prisoners is evocative of the world that the island shares with Waiting for Godot and the themes of anticipation and waiting. Since John is later on in the course of the play informed that his 10-year sentence has been commuted to 3, leaving him with a mere 3 months of incarceration to bear. This in itself becomes the occasion for the two prisoners to rehearse the various situations that they imagined would be pertinent to John's arrival home among his family and comrades. One significant difference between Beckett's and Fugard's plays, however, is that in Waiting for Godot, the two tramps do not enact multiple identities. Even though they imagine different situations, Estragon and Vladimir do not alter their essential personalities to match these situations. They are not characters rehearsing the identities of other characters in different scenarios. The situations that Estragon and Vladimir evoke flow directly from their vaguely remembered past and the future they anticipate in Waiting for Godot. The only radically different situation to theirs is provided when Lucky and Pozzo enter the play, where the responses of the two tramps to the fresh pair provide different trajectories for interpreting their own condition. In Fugard's play, on the other hand, John and Winston proliferate scenarios and the responses that they might adduce in anticipation of putative interlocutors. This makes the play a medium of heterogeneous mediations of the self, since the effect of the proliferation of scenarios And the rehearsals attendant upon these scenarios is first to multiply other interlocutory cells, and second to engender new modes of address in relation to such imagined others. I would like to suggest that it is this medium of heterogeneities that gives the play its insightful and radical edge, and not just the enactment of the trial of Antigone that all things seem to lead up to, and that in fact closes the action. The trial of Antigone in the island is a major interpretative telescoping of what happens in Sophocles' play. In the original Antigone, there is no trial in any straightforward sense of the word. What there is a major clash between Antigone and Creon, and a lengthy debate about the rights of the family as opposed to those of the city. Recall at any rate that Creon is Antigone's uncle on her mother's side, and that she is betrothed to Haemon, his son, and things become somewhat more complicated than in Fugard's rendition. In telescoping the meaning of Antigone into the relative rights of the state versus those of the citizen under apartheid, Fugard is drawing inspiration for a tradition of interpreting Sophocles' play that can be traced back at least to Hegel. In his own account, Hegel was to note that the essential form of tragedy depended on certain inescapable collisions, but that these collisions were not necessarily the collisions of directly opposed ethical conceptions of the citizen, but rather conceptions that essentially participated of one another. Thus, writing about the mutual entanglement of the oikos, family, principle, within the polis, or the political principle in Greek tragedy, Hegel suggests that the opposition is that of the body politic, the opposition that is between ethical life in its social universality and the family as the natural ground of moral relations. The dialectical interplay that Hegel stipulates is between a form of social universality, essentially an abstraction, and a natural ground of moral relations that must perforce be concrete and immanent within the microcosm of interpersonal relations, that is, the family. We must qualify Hegel's terms slightly in order to account for a different kind of dialectical pairing, particularly so as the ethics of a social universality in a place like South Africa were seriously called into question. In other words, social universality cannot be taken for granted under conditions of oppression. The social universal is itself a ground for contestation and struggle. And since the domain of interpersonal relationships both offers the grounds for working through morality and is itself produced by the essential logic that dominates any system, that domain then takes on a coloration from the problematic universal that is being shaped under the impress of unfreedom. To recap our discussion so far, Athol Fugard's The Island allows us to first keep in the foreground of our minds the materialities of bodies in action. Second, focus upon the multiple rehearsals of the self that take place against a horizon of anticipation. Third, perceive the essential lineaments of the struggle between social universality and the interpersonal and familial grounds for the elaboration of morality. And fourth, keep in view the oscillating relationship between the depicted foreground of the action and the wider social and political background that frame the action. The Island is one of Athol Fugard's most brilliant plays and bears resonances to many situations that are unfolding in our world today. Thank you. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.